We're live, Tom.
Great. Okay, welcome everyone to this our October seminar, which will focus on Budget 2022, and we have three speakers today. We have the usual format, so we'll go for potentially 90 minutes, depending on how long the Q&A lasts. Each speaker is going to talk for about 15 minutes with their slides, and then we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. So our three speakers are Michelle Murphy from Social Justice Ireland, Gerard Brady from IBEC, and Michael Taft from SIPTU. First up is going to be Michelle. Michelle is a research and policy analyst at Social Justice Ireland. She's done several pieces of research on social policy, with particular focus on the European Union and on issues related to income distribution, poverty, and social inclusion. She has two master's degrees, one in social justice and public policy from DCU and one in European studies from UCD. She is also a member of the steering committee of Basic Income Ireland and is a trustee of FASTA. How do you pronounce that, Michelle? FASTA. So Michelle, you've got 15 minutes and looking forward to hearing it.
Great, thank you, Tom. I'm just going to share my screen now. So hopefully everyone, can you see my slides? Yeah, great. So first of all, thanks to Tom and to Nevin for the opportunity to present. So we published our response to Budget 2022 last Wednesday. So the document is available on our website, socialjustice.ie. I'm not going to go through everything in the document. I'm just going to look at a few elements of what was in the budget and I suppose reflect on them. So first of all, I'm going to start with the positives. The fact that government accepted the OECD agreement on a minimum corporate tax rate of 15%, it's very welcome and long overdue. The funding for residential community retrofit schemes and that 109 million targeted funding for households who are in energy poverty or who are at risk of energy poverty, that certainly is very welcome, as is the investment in community health networks, which are really going to be the cornerstone of primary care, sort of preventative health care, and when they will be the cornerstone of sláinte care itself. We welcome the expansion of debt. That's something we've argued for a number of years and advocated for, and I think particularly now in light of the COVID-induced school closures and the impact that has had in terms of learning loss and trying to close the attainment gap between students from disadvantaged backgrounds and their peers, the expansion of debt is vital to this. The increased, I suppose, teaching supports and posts announced and the increased funding for skills development were also welcome. We very much welcome the allocation of over €1 billion to overseas development assistance. That gets us up to 0.43% of GNI star, still a distance from the 0.7%, but the increased allocation is welcome. And a qualified welcome to the allocation for a basic income pilot program. Unfortunately, we don't have the detail yet, which is why the welcome is qualified. We've long argued for a pilot basic income program. I suppose one of the areas we'd be looking at is to see how long it would run. I mean, for it to really have an impact, it'd need to run for 3 years, just to look at how it's working in terms of market income, the ability to develop skills, overall health and well-being of participants, what likely impact it has on the labour supply, the sort of distributional consequences, the exchequer impact if we're going to look at extending it beyond the pilot. So really we'd be looking for 3 years, and the pilot itself, it must be a basic income pilot, and that means that there's no means test or work requirement. A sort of a rejuvenated working family payment is laid out in pathways to work, wouldn't be in our eye a feasible basic income pilot. Now, in terms of the not so positive developments, I suppose in terms of low income households, they didn't fare so well at all in the budget. Looking at a single person on job seekers allowance, they'll see their increase €5 a week next year. That's €260 a year. For a single person earning €25,000, they get an increase of €2.21 a week, €115 a year. A single person on 50,000 takes home almost an additional €8 a week, or €415 a year. I suppose in terms of our response, we're very disappointed that there was no commitment to benchmarking social welfare rates to 27.5% of average earnings. We'd asked government to commit to this over 2 budgets. This is the benchmark which was set in 2007. The 2007 benchmark was 30% of gross average industrial earnings. So to bring it up to what's measured today, average weekly earnings, that equates to 27.5% of that, which is about just over 222 euros a week. We'd asked for that gap to be closed over 2 budgets, because if you benchmark social welfare payments, and if you just benchmark it at that target, you'd list 12,000 adults of working age out of poverty. And it's really key to meeting the targets that are set out in the roadmap for social inclusion, which are a reiteration of the targets, the poverty targets we'd set for ourselves in 2020, but are not going to meet. So, I mean, it was incredibly disappointing for us. Some workers will get a welcome increase from the minimum wage, but not all. And I suppose what you'll see is many low paid workers gained very little, because the adjustments in the tax bands, by their very nature, benefit the middle to higher income earners. And the challenge is that this group has been consistently missed in recent budgets. And one way to reach them would have been to make tax credits refundable. That would have targeted low paid workers. Specifically, it would have made the tax system fairer, and would mean any future changes to tax credits would benefit all workers equally. Now, in terms of looking at the impact of the headline tax and welfare changes of the budget, I suppose you see here, you see the gains for people on social welfare, and then the gains of incomes 15,000, 25,50 and up. And I suppose you see there's sort of a sag there from the people on social welfare payments and up to 50,000. And that shows that those low paid workers, you know, are missing out. And by not making tax credits refundable, which is one of the key policies for targeting that group, it's very challenging to reach them, you know, in the absence of sort of a social wage, and in the absence of the, I suppose, state-funded services and infrastructures required to support families and households. Looking at the impact then over 2 budgets, and I'm just focusing on welfare-dependent households here. So that's the 2 budgets of this government, and I suppose the majority of the impact here comes from the changes just announced last Tuesday. So you'll see a single person gains €5, a couple €8.30. This is a weekly impact. A pensioner couple gain €12, almost €12.20, up to a couple with 2 children, €16.17, or a lone parent with a child, €15.86. But I suppose when you look at these gains, while welcome, they're also small. There were no core welfare increases in the 2 budgets prior to this. And I suppose it's worth bearing in mind what the poverty line is for some of these households. So for a single unemployed person, the poverty line is just under 14,950 euros a year. And for a single parent and a child, or a lone parent and a child, it's just under 990,000 euros a year. So that's the poverty line. And on those households which are on these welfare payments, they're obviously living below that poverty line. So it's worth bearing that in mind when you look at the overall impact of the budget and the gap that's now going to open up between these households and those households on higher incomes, and those households who will see an increase in their wages in the coming year. Then looking at the changes of over 2 budgets on households with jobs, and just to preface this in that it doesn't take account of changes, indirect tax changes such as VAT or property tax, for example. And you see that it's those low paid earners. So a couple with 1 earner and 30,000 over 2 budgets gain 39 cents a week. A couple with on the same income, 1 earner with 2 children gain the same amount, 39 cents a week. A single with a job at 30,000, €2.35 a week. So you can see there that, you know, those people in lower paid jobs, and that's about 1.2 million households, or as revenue counts them, revenue units, what they gained was about €2.35 a week or less over 2 budgets. And, you know, that's a considerable number of people that, you know, are going to struggle with the increased cost of living. And I think we need a better budgetary strategy to focus on those households. Now, I suppose moving on to some other elements of the budget then beyond income itself. I suppose that one of the big ticket items that we've been talking about and has made headlines for the past years is housing. So how did budget 2022 do on housing? Well, it didn't do incredibly well. It did commit to access to home ownership, but it didn't really do anything on the supply side area. So it renewed the Help to Buy scheme, which is regressive, it's expensive, it artificially maintains very high prices for new builds. We'd argue that this scheme should have been abandoned, and you invest this money in terms of into homeless preventative services, for example. The budget, it announced 4,000 additional affordable homes and 4,000 additional affordable cost rental homes, but it didn't take account of current unmet housing needs. So the housing need development assessment and housing for all is based on future household formation. So that ignores the need that's already unmet and that's been building up over a number of years. So, I mean, that's considerable. It's about 90,500 households. So there was nothing in the budget to deal with that. In terms of the targets in housing for all, one of the key means of reaching these targets is going to be affordable land, but there was no reference to affordable land sharing measures in the budget itself. There was an announcement of a zoned land tax, but with a 2 or 3 year lead-in time, that's far too long in terms of the challenges we face in terms of housing delivery. There was an allocation of 194 million for homeless services, emergency accommodation and the other supports. But I mean, where were the preventative measures there in terms of stopping people falling into homelessness in the first place? I mean, so overall, I mean, in terms of housing, budget 2022 didn't do a huge amount. I suppose particularly for renters, it did very little. And, young people, they've been priced out of the housing market. And in terms of rents, they're a considerable portion of any income that they make. And budget 2022 didn't really deliver for them. Then coming to environment, I mean, there was some welcome progress here, but I think far more could have been done. Reduce public transport fares for young people is positive, particularly for those in urban areas. As I said, we welcome the ring-fencing of carbon taxes for retrofitting and energy poverty. But more is required in this area. And I think low-cost retrofit loans are not an attractive option to many households. Then there is the issue of households living in energy poverty and rental accommodation, for example. So how do you target those for energy efficiency upgrades? And then I suppose there was a missed opportunity on the environmental front. For example, there wasn't a reorganization of the PSO levy to take account of aggregate demand, which would, I suppose, be a first step towards dealing with the pressure of data centers on the national grid. There wasn't an introduction of a levy on single-use coffee cups or the introduction of a deposit and return scheme for sealed beverage containers, which would be a key component of any circular economy strategy. There was no move to introducing an aviation tax. I suppose the climate bill is going to be coming out, and a lot, we've seen a lot in headlines about reducing the national herd and sectoral contributions. But I mean, the transport sector is also a key emitter of emissions, and aviation is one of the key polluters there. And jet kerosene is not subject to mineral oil tax, and until such time as moves are taken to address this at a European level, we had proposed an aviation tax of €10. Here, budget 2022 didn't implement this. So really, this sector is more or less getting a free pass, whereas, everyone else is making their contributions. So there's sort of an imbalance there. And then finally, it's really disappointing that there was no move taken to look at those potentially harmful environmental subsidies that equated to €2.4 billion of revenue foregone in 2018. I mean, a just transition is going to cost a whole lot more than what any carbon tax revenue will ever bring in. Looking at some of those subsidies and actually putting in sunset clauses, removing them and taking in that revenue would go a considerable way towards supporting communities and households and regions and workers as we move towards a greener economy. So finally, then coming to taxation, as I said, we welcome the commitment to a minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. However, we regret there was no broadening of the overall base, and I suppose no outline of how we're going to gradually increase our overall tax take, which you know, is required if we're going to even maintain an existing level of service for public services. I suppose the long-term direction of fiscal policy was unclear. I mean, the government has stated that we stand to lose up to €2 billion per annum as a result of signing up to the OECD tax proposals, but there's no strategy as to how we're going to replace that revenue. And obviously, to replace some of that revenue, we're going to have to look at broadening the base and increasing the tax take overall. There was a missed opportunity to look at a levy on empty houses, for example, reintroducing windfall gains tax on rezoned land, a site value tax on underdevelopment land, or restoration of the non-principal private residence tax, for example. You know, none of those were in the mix in the budget, which is disappointing, because we are going to have to take steps to increase the tax take and broaden the overall base. So I'm going to finish up now. In terms of Social Justice Ireland's overall assessment of the budget, low to middle income households were left behind. So that's those households on social welfare and those households on low pay. There wasn't any real progress in major areas, particularly in terms of housing. There was limited progress in terms of the environment and climate. In terms of taxation, you know, the progress we need to be seeing, and I suppose the changes and the reform we need to be seeing were not forthcoming. But there were some welcome developments, as I mentioned, the ODA budget, the investment in community health networks, education, and the basic income pilot, among others. So I am going to finish there. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you, Michelle. Very, very interesting indeed. And I know we'll get into it more during the Q&A session. So our second speaker is Gerard Brady. Gerard Brady is Chief Economist at IBEC, which is, of course, Ireland's largest business representative group. Gerard works on regular analysis of economic issues for a business audience, shapes IBEC's economic, tax, and fiscal policy positions, and advises companies and sectoral organizations. He is a current member on the National Statistics Board, as well as representing Irish business in a number of international economic and tax fora, such as Business at the OECD and Business Europe. Prior to joining IBEC in 2013, Gerard worked as a lecturer in economics in UCC, and he is a previous winner of the Miriam Hatterman O'Brien Prize, awarded by the Foundation for Fiscal Studies. So Gerard, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Tom. And just to check, can you see slides okay?
I can see your opening slide at the moment. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. That's great. And good afternoon, everyone. Look, I'll talk for about 15 minutes and talk a little bit about the backdrop in the first instance, some of the more detailed areas of interest from a business perspective, or of most interest, and then maybe some of the, I guess, longer term strategic pieces at the end, and I'll try and keep it as quickly as possible. I suppose the first thing to say is probably that the budget, from our point of view, was framed in a context of much more important decisions made either side of it, either made just before the budget when it came to changes in international tax rules and Ireland signing up to that, or the announcement of the new National Development Plan. And this week and over the coming weeks, we're going to see publication of the Climate Action Plan, the carbon budget, and sectoral targets underneath that are going to have a major impact. And if you look across those three areas in particular, they were probably all more important in and of themselves than the budget day itself this year. So it was a kind of a strange budget in that sense, and that was eclipsed by other events, whereas it usually in itself is the main event. So just starting on two things. One is the National Development Plan, and you can see the chart here on the right, the kind of vintages of how much the government has intended to spend in each version of their capital plan since the 2015 budget. And what's pretty obvious, and it wasn't a big part of budget day, but it actually took up the largest single chunk of what is going to be spent additional next year, over €1 billion, was the increase in capital investment. So from our point of view, you can see the light blue line there on the right hand side, was the NDP in 2018, and the follow through on that in the red line budget 2020 plans, and then we can see the NDP in 2021, which is a 25% increase or so in the level of spending that's going to happen over the course of the National Development Plan relative to what it was in 2018. So in the first instance, before we started the budget, from an IBEC perspective in recent years, the core of our view of where fiscal policy should be going is that it should be focused in that investment area rather than on day-to-day tax or spending. And the government, to be fair, have prioritised that. So we are now going to, over the next decade or so, if plans turn out, and look, Ireland has a history of abandoning capital plans midstream if things go wrong elsewhere. But if it is followed through on, it would mean we'd be one of the top investing countries in Europe in terms of public investment, which is obviously welcome. And the reason that it's obviously welcome, Michelle talked about housing, but also this challenge that we see on the left-hand side, which is EPA projections of under existing policy commitments, including €100 tonne carbon tax, 1 million electric vehicles and all the rest. We see the green line of where they expect carbon emissions would go out to 2030 with no extra effort on top of existing commitments, which in themselves are quite ambitious in some areas. And the pink line is where we have now legally committed to go, and we'll see the outworkings of that this week in the Climate Action Plan and sectoral targets. So it does mean, both from a public and private point of view, that there is going to be an enormous effort, a necessary effort, but an enormous effort needed over the next decade. And in that context, where we see budgets and budget days, is that a lot of it is going to have to be pre-committed in kind of long-term public investment to try and meet both housing needs, broader societal needs in areas like transport, but also, and mainly actually in this area of the low carbon transition. We also saw this week an announcement from the European Commission about the European fiscal rules. When they are reintroduced, being able to green those rules is going to be hugely important in terms of being able to allow countries meet the expectations that are now set for them. So in that context, where a lot of the money is already pre-committed to public investment, budget days are going to become kind of boring. And we saw that this year. Look, it's probably not a bad thing that we saw a more boring budget this year, because in the previous 2 years, we had seen extremely unboring budgets in terms of the quantity of money that was spent, just short of 10% of GDP in each of 2020 and 2021 committed on budget day or between budget day and the July stimulus in 2020 or budget 2020. And what we've seen is those enormous budgets, even in historical terms, kind of a return to normal after that under the government's new fiscal framework. So we still have a high deficit, although it is coming down a lot quicker than many, including the Department of Finance, expected. And we'll probably see only a deficit for funding that public capital investment next year or from next year onwards. But within that, and apart from that, I think where we're going to see the debate very much move is not about the quantity that's spent on budget day, but it's going to be about where you raise taxes to pay for the inevitable challenges we're going to face in terms of population aging, in terms of demand for public services and other areas. And I think the Commission on Taxation and Social Welfare has just launched its consultation on that today, which will mean, while we had a very boring budget this year, which is really housekeeping more than anything, I think, we're going to see more strategic budgets on lots of areas, which I'll talk about at the end, that in the coming years. So this might be the first of the welcome boring budgets, but there is going to be much more talk about the how taxes are raised, where they're raised, and how we pay for some of the things that we have committed to or will need to commit to in future years. I'll talk about 3 areas. One, the competitiveness side and Indigenous business side. 2, the kind of quality of life issues and some of the major ones for business. And 3, the FDI side of the business view of the budget. And look, by its nature, a lot of the things that happen on budget day were pretty small in the grand scheme of things. They weren't world changing. This was not a strategic budget in terms of enterprise policy or industrial policy. it was very much a kind of a begin to winding down some of the COVID supports, and it was putting in place some of the supports or some of the changes that will be made in the long term. And then the rest of the budget, if you look at it, was mainly dedicated to two things. One was indexing the tax system, the income tax system, and the other was partially indexing and partially indexing the social welfare system, including to offset some of the pretty significant fuel price increases we're going to see this winter. So from an industrial policy point of view, Indigenous side, we saw the extension of the EWSS, which was welcome, even though it's on reduced terms. Across Europe, we see a lot of wage supports, particularly in the UK, being withdrawn, probably in our view, too quickly, before countries are out of the woods that they're withdrawing some of the key supports, and that's going to cause problems in the labour market. EWSS keeps people close to their employer or close to the labour market, whilst also allowing them to receive a subsidy for keeping people in employment while you're down significant amounts of turnover. The EWSS scheme has worked really well, and our view is that, look, the extension out to April is welcome, even at reduced rates. It is a scheme that has to wind down the long run. I guess over the next coming budgets, we'll probably be having that discussion, which kind of started and then stopped, about what kind of a social insurance system we look at for future recessions and future downturns and business cycles. But I think that probably is a budget 2023 and onwards issue. On the Brexit side, the major change that we saw was the announcement of the Brexit Adjustment Reserve. Although we got very little detail on it, we know how much is going to be spent in each of the next 2 years, but it won't be for a number of weeks yet until we see what that is going to be spent on and how it supports both companies, households, and particularly the farming sector and primary producers through a period which, particularly from January to July next year, could be pretty tricky for them. And then finally, on the startup side and the kind of small business side, there was very little change in the budget. Really, there was an announcement of a digital gaming sector tax credit, which is interesting, much like Section 481, the film tax credit, and some extension of the EII scheme, which, to be honest, is really quite technical and won't make a huge difference. So what you're seeing there is really a plan to unwind some of the supports that were in place, but unwind them in a pace that probably, in our view, is appropriate from the Indigenous side. Then on this kind of building back better agenda, so, making sure that Ireland has decent quality of life, that it's a decent place to live in terms of attracting workers and retaining workers in the country, probably three key areas to this. One is the childcare side. We saw, as Michelle said, announcements on childcare which were welcome. They probably won't go far enough, and it's one area that we've said probably needs to be accelerated in terms of there is a plan for funding childcare in place, but that plan has a timeline that's 7 or 8 years long rather than 2 or 3 years long, and I think we're going to need to see an acceleration of that plan over the coming years. But this year's changes were welcome in terms of additional funding, additional capacity, and it will help solve some of the retention issues in the sector, but it won't solve all of them. On the housing side, I think there wasn't much, as Michelle said, on budget day itself. I think the National Development Plan is where the action is on housing. And if you look at the capital budget for housing, there's probably two things. One is that the capital budget will increase pretty significantly next year and into the coming years, both for cost rental and social housing. The crucial thing from our point of view is that needs to move to additions to the capital or to the housing stock, rather than either purchasing housing that isn't pre-purchased, that it's purchasing housing without pre-purchasing or without adding to demand or adding to supply, or that it's funneled into HAP rather than into new build social housing. So there is money there, and there will be money there on the housing side, but solving some of those key issues in terms of how you deliver that housing is going to be crucial. And then finally, on the low carbon side, I guess this budget, we'll see carbon tax go up, and that's welcome from our point of view, that it will have to continue to go up to give certainty in terms of investment decisions for our members who are going to have to go on a big journey in the next decade. There was very little on business supports, but most of it, understandably, I think from our point of view, has gone to household supports, particularly through the fuel allowance and retrofit, to try and offset, as I said, some of the energy price spikes that we are going to see in the next coming months. And then finally on the business side, the FDI driven side of the business model, both including inward multinationals and our outward bound multinationals, the Irish PLCs and others. It's probably worth reflecting at the very start this chart, the share of US multinationals in private sector wages in Ireland leaves us much more exposed to changes in the US and elsewhere on global tax. And there are really big changes happening, and I'll talk about the outworkings of them in a minute. The key messaging in the budget, it was probably a footnote. To be honest, there wasn't a huge amount in the budget about it, and not a huge reaction to the big announcement which had been made the week before and that we welcomed. But in budget 2023, we probably will need to see more strategic view of industrial policy in areas like education funding, in areas of innovation funding in particular, and digitization, that we're going to need to see the government be much clearer in terms of what their strategy is, which at the moment doesn't really exist in many of those areas, particularly on the funding side. And if you're going to offset the changes in competitiveness because of changes in tax rates, which are there, you're going to have to remodel the business model to make us more attractive as both from a quality of life point of view in terms of a place where you can keep skilled workers and where skilled workers want to live, but also in terms of education funding, innovation funding, and other areas of the business model where we've been focused on for a long time, because the inevitability of changes in tax was always there to some extent. It has happened now, but budget 2023, I think, will be where the big reaction is. Is that OECD deal finished on tax? I guess there was a big announcement of it, but there's still a long way to go. US Congress in particular has signed off nothing yet. The US is the driver of the deal at the OECD, but it still has to bring something to Congress that works, and that is proven troublesome for them. I think they will pass something on the minimum tax side that means that we will have a 15% effective rate rather than just a headline rate in 2023, more than likely. On Pillar 1, where, as Michelle said, the government reckon we might lose 2 billion because of reallocation to consumer economies of some of the tax base, I'm not so sure that US Congress will be able to pass anything on that. So it's something to watch very much over the coming months. In Europe, we'll see a European directive, no matter what happens at the OECD or in the US. We'll see 2 European directives on this in the new year and one on the minimum tax before Christmas. So even if the OECD deal doesn't move forward because of the US or moves forward without the US, Europe is going to push on with this, with Ireland in tow in the next 12 months or so. So there will be big significant change there. And I guess our already looking forward to budget 2023 key issue is that they're going to need to react to that in terms of industrial policy and be very clear about what they're going to do and what Ireland's industrial policy is in not post-tax. Tax is still there, but in an era where tax is going to be much less important than it previously was. And then finally, just thinking about future budgets, there's a huge kind of wheel of stuff here that there is to worry about, and that I think now we're going to have to deal with. So I said we have a boring budget this year, but I think we have a lot of processes, whether it's the Climate Council announcements in the coming days, whether it's the Commission on Taxation and Social Welfare, or some of the other processes that are going on in the background in policy making that might pretty significantly reform the Irish business model in the coming years. Across a number of areas. I've talked a bit about corporate tax. The onshoring and shortening of supply chains is kind of linked into that post-COVID, and how small open economies work in a world where globalization is slowing. Climate change I've talked about a little bit. The end of the education dividend, where over the last 30 years, a lot of our positive economic growth out of education has come from the expansion of the numbers of people getting higher levels of education. That dividend is more or less running out now, and it really is about quality and funding, a question we are grappling with. Population aging, which is another issue we still have to deal with, the impact of Brexit competitiveness, and then these quality of life challenges. And particularly, I think future budgets and coming budgets, and that Commission on Tax is going to look very different in terms of how it looks at how you raise tax, particularly for the social insurance model, what Ireland's model looks like. And I think the direction we are heading is probably, and I guess we can disagree on what the kind of makeup of this is, but generally it's moving towards a more European model, both in terms of industrial policy and in terms of social insurance model. How quickly that happens, whether it's politically acceptable, and all of those other changes in between are going to be defining in the coming budgets. So looking forward, there's still, despite the budget days being boring, there's still going to be a lot of strategic decisions to be made. So I'll leave it there, Tom.
Well, Gerard, thanks so much for that, and certainly just no shortage of questions for later on. A lot to chew on there. So our third speaker today is Michael Taft. Michael Taft is a researcher with SIPTU. Prior to that, he was with Unite Union. He's a regular commentator on his blog, Notes on the Front, and has long been a commentator on Irish economic and social issues, and certainly is well known within the trade union movement and beyond. So with that, Michael, I will give the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I'll just see if this works. Is that coming up?
Yeah, I can see it fine. You might want to give it the full screen.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do that. There's some icon in my way.
I can see it pretty well anyway.
Anyway, I'll try to. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble here because I have this. There's this darned icon.
Are you able to switch to the second slide, Michael?
No, it's there. There we go.
Very good. I can see that.
Okay, I just want to focus on this thing. I just want to focus on one particular area, and that is the area of fiscal targets. Because it's been quite a roller coaster ride this year. Back in April, the government projected a small deficit of 800 million euros in 2025, but a more pessimistic reading of the economy coming out of the crisis led the summer economic statement to project a deficit of over 7 billion euros again by 2025. However, in last week's budget, because of a very sharp turnaround in terms of tax revenue and lower expenditure, the budget has now revised this target again, and now will be running nearly a €1 billion surplus by 2025. So we're going from a substantial deficit to a surplus within a matter of few months. So what's wrong with that? Isn't a balanced budget a good thing? Here's the problem. The fact is current spending is being squeezed in order to pay for a balanced budget. Just give you one particular particular stat. It shows that real public service expenditure, that is after inflation per capita, will fall from this year down to 2023, start rising again, but it will be below the levels this year. So that, as we can see, there's a squeezing effect. Now, of course, people will say, didn't public services get a big boost in 2020? That's correct, but I'll come back to that later. But what we're seeing is this squeezing and attempting to keep future increases at the rate at or below the rate of inflation. A similar process is at work in social payments, which will fall 15% in real terms between this year and 2025. Now, much of this will be due to the fall in unemployment payments. However, it should be noted that from 2022 on, the increase in pensioner numbers will be greater than the fall in unemployment, yet social payment spending continues to decline. In that respect, something has to give. The one bright spot in the budget projections is the continual rise in public investment. It will rise in real terms between 2020 and 2025 by over 60%. However, even then we have to be cautious. I mean, the issue is not so much the envelope of expenditure, but the quality of the expenditure. The NDP's kind of buffet approach doesn't give much one confidence. We're still in the dark about a lot of issues regarding prioritization, phasing in, even the costings. And the IMF has found that there is a public investment management efficiency gap of about 58% compared to advanced economies. And we're on the 50% below their comparison that they use. Now, the minister has said that they have made improvements since then in terms of procurement and financial control. This would be extremely important and also beneficial because even according to the IMF, even a slight increase in your management efficiency can give the economy a significant enough boost. In other words, better bang for your buck. And so that would mean avoiding fiascos like rural broadband and the Children's Hospital, which can quickly burn through an investment budget. But at the end of the day, we will see this squeezing, what might be called squeezing the social. Primary government expenditure, that's government expenditure after interest, excluding interest rates, it will flatline between 2020 and 2025 and actually fall in terms of per capita. So we will see, according to the projections, public services and social protection paying the price for a balanced budget. As I said, I mean, there were increases in 2020. Public services spending went up by 11%. Social protection went up by 24%. Overall spending increased by nearly 20%. These were big increases to reflect the severity of the public health crisis. And the government will be pulling back on these increases by maintaining expenditure in real terms over 5 years. Now, this process of flatlining essentially the current budget, will be facilitated by a public debate that assumes that Ireland is already a big state, as it's being called, or that we are becoming a big state, that public spending and taxation has already grown to new, unprecedented heights. My favorite newspaper headline from last year was, "How are we going to pay for the Irish big state utopia?" Now, this is all utterly untrue. All the evidence available from the government projections show that we will continue to operate under a low tax, low spend, low service model. I'm just going to quickly go through 3 charts. Again, spending on investments as a percentage of GNI. Taking a very long look back over 35 years. We can see that we started out at about 18%, and we're going to end up at 18%. That spike in the middle, by the way, doesn't mean that we spent more on public services during the recession. That's just a function of GNI falling faster than the cuts to public services. But the noteworthy thing is that by 2025, we will be spending less as a percentage of GNI on public services than we did in 2019, the year before the pandemic. Again, total primary spending, we're going to see that we're returning back to pre-crash levels. And again, we will be below the 2019 thing, and the same thing with government revenue. So all 3 things give us the same story, that public spending and taxation will revert to a low tax, low spend model. Actually, we'll be maintaining it. I shouldn't say revert because we never moved away from it. We'll be maintaining that type of model. Now, unless you can describe the pre-crash levels as a period of being a big state, I think that's dubious. Another way to test this thesis of how we're comparing is to take a look at the 2025 estimate in terms of in comparison to our EU peer group. That's other high income economies such as Denmark and Finland and Netherlands and Germany and France. And as we can see, we lag behind our peer group considerably. Even if we account for older age demographics, that is the fact that we don't have to spend as much because we don't have as many pensioners, but without accounting for our youth demographic, which would actually mean we'd have to spend more on things like education and supports for family and children because we have a much higher youth demographic. Just taking in the old age demographics, we'd still have to spend about 10 billion euros more a year by 2025 and 7 to 8 billion euros more on public services just to reach the average of our peer group. And in terms of debt, because there's this kind of thing in the public debate about how our debts are at very high levels, it leaves us quite vulnerable in the future. It should be worth noting that again, this is just a projection from the IMF, but their projected debt levels for 2025 sees that Ireland is below the Eurozone average, which I think is actually a bit of an achievement, given that we are still carrying the additional burden from the banking crisis, namely the bailing out of senior creditors in Anglo-Irish and Irish nationwide. So this projection of being below the Eurozone average contrasts with much of the commentary that effectively attempts to scaremonger over Irish debt levels. The government is moving further and faster towards a balanced budget than what is required by the currently suspended fiscal rules. The rules allow for a structural deficit of 1%. Structural deficit in the table is the structural budget balance, SBB. As you can see, we're pretty much balanced already, although it should be noted that measuring the structural budget balance during such a volatile period as the pandemic can be a fairly hit and miss affair. Actually, measuring the structural budget balance itself can be pretty hit and miss since you can't directly measure it. But in 2023, both the general government balance, and that is just the straightforward measurement in euros and cents, and the structural budget balance are pretty much move at the same pace. So that actually, if you think about it, in 2023, we will effectively have a balanced budget, well before anything that was contemplated in the summer economic statement. Now, what would be an alternative approach? Because what we need to do is maximize the fiscal flexibility that's available to us if we want to transition from a low tax, low spend model in order to actually meet the urgent social needs that faces our population. Now, SIPTU has proposed a 2% deficit by 2025, but let's kind of just use the limits of the fiscal rules, which is this 1%. This would raise considerable resources for investment in the social infrastructure, whether that is in public services or in social protection. And as you can see, the additional revenue using the fiscal rules would, had we stuck to it for next year, would have raised an additional 2 billion euros, or if you're using the GDP as a benchmark, nearly 4 billion euros. And by 2025, we could have, using these fiscal rules, additional revenue of about 3.5 billion or 6.5 billion if you use the GDP. So that would give us considerable flexibility in terms of meeting our fiscal, a better set of fiscal targets and still remaining within the fiscal rules as they're stated now. But here's the key thing: fiscal maneuver and deficit spending is not intended to fund all the necessary measures in the social infrastructure. This will require increases in government revenue. However, the key point of using parameters that allow us more flexibility means that we can phase in revenue increases over a number of years to limit disruption and negative impacts. For instance, there is a clear need to increase employer social insurance. However, any type of action that would see, a significant jump in that could have negative impacts for wages and for businesses. Increase in employer social insurance should be phased over a long period in almost homeopathic annual increases rather than ramping it up in pursuit of an unnecessary balanced budget. Another example is something that NERI has talked about, and a number of others, is a net assets tax, which in the old vernacular is a wealth tax. Even were a wealth tax introduced in this year's budget, it would probably take 2 to 3 years before you reach the optimal revenue that can be obtained under that tax. So you can see that there are lag periods when it comes to revenue increases, not only because of the bureaucratic nature of whatever might be the new tax or a tax increase, but also there should be a lag so that we're not disrupting the economic cycle. So social need requires an urgent policy response, but fiscal maneuverability allows us to ensure that the revenue increases eventually over time can make up for any type of deficit, or if we need to move to a balanced budget, we can do so, but still maintaining a fiscal stance which actually supports public services and social protection. So just to conclude, it's from a reading of the budget projections, the government, well, it doesn't appear as it is intent on maintaining a low tax, low spend, low service economy. Now, they may know this, they may be giving themselves room for movement, knowing that they cannot meet this fiscal target without impacting on public services and social expenditure, which could be politically very unpopular. But just as likely, they could be making room for tax cuts. So all we can do is deal with the baseline, and their baseline, their starting point, is to maintain a small state, not a big state, not a social state. So in the years ahead, we will probably, as we have this year, rightfully so, by the way, people have criticized the government's response to actually existing social conditions. However, the main issue I would suggest will not be one of prioritization or increasing taxes on the rich. The real issue will be the unnecessary, premature, and damaging drive to balance the budget in the short term. That is what we must address. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Michael. So we've had 3 different presentations, different emphasis from each one, but clear certain themes are starting to emerge. I think there's a general consensus that budget 2022 was effectively a placeholder budget, kind of between eras, not quite post-pandemic, but certainly not one of the radical budgets that we're likely to see in terms of significant policy changes. Gerard's made the point that the NDP, the international tax changes, and the climate action plan will all be much more important. And I think that's true. But I do think budget 2023 will be a much more transformational budget, or certainly budget 2024 will be. The Commission on Tax and Welfare will have reported, but the Commission itself will only report in July of next year, so that may be too soon to really do significant things for budget 2023. So it may be the year after. Just in terms of that, then, I mean, all three of you have talked about future policy. Michelle, you've talked about the sufficiency of welfare payments. Gerard, you've talked about the debate about where we can raise taxes potentially, and perhaps a debate about whether we should raise taxes. And Michael, you've emphasised that we're along the tracks of a low revenue, low spend model, looking out into the future. So with that in mind, I wonder to what extent you think there is scope for increasing revenue, not necessarily from taxes, it could be social insurance or other sources potentially. Do you think that's, first of all, do you think that is the correct strategy to take? If so, why? And what sources of revenue would you be looking to raise? Or from what sources, I should say. Michelle, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, well, I think, you know, we're long on the record saying we do need to increase revenue and the overall tax take. So if we're going to fund the services we'll need into the future, and I suppose that the services that, you know, people want and people require, I mean, even just look at the Gerard mentioned the childcare issue in the budget, and effectively, you know, we've just almost locked in high fees, but you know, no progress on additional places, on rolling out a publicly funded model, on a living wage for childcare workers, for example. So I mean, in terms of raising revenue, I mean, we think overall you need to be setting yourself a target for what you're going to increase the overall tax take by, and then how you get there. So we would be looking at a target of we'd said at 2017 figures of about 17,000 euro per capita of an increase. And you know, you do this through reform, obviously, through broadening the tax base and through increasing the overall tax take. So I mentioned tax expenditures as one area there, and you know, we'd hope that the Commission of Taxation and Welfare will certainly have a recommendation in terms of looking at tax expenditures, I suppose starting with the environmentally harmful ones, with, you know, the climate action plan and the targets they're going to be in that. And I see Minister McDonnell is out today saying we're going to meet our agricultural emissions targets without reducing productivity or the herd. And I think that's, you know, no matter what way you look at that, that's going to be challenging. So there's certainly an element there in terms of carbon tax. The minimum effective corporate tax rate will go to a certain element there, but then you need to look at things like social insurance, for example, like things like a site value tax, like I mentioned, looking at capital gains tax, capital acquisitions tax, standard rating pension tax relief, standard rating discretionary non-pension tax expenditures, for example, looking at where you set the minimum effective corporate tax rate, looking at limiting the ability to carry losses forward for businesses. We'd be looking at a rolling limit for 5 years, for example, looking at reforming the research and development tax credit itself. We have a refundable tax credit for businesses in this regard, but I mean, can we reorient that so that it focuses SMEs more? And you know, it's certainly a costly credit. And then can we look at introducing an actual you know, refundable tax credit for low paid workers? But I think the first thing we need to do is, you know, and I think Gerard and Michael have both alluded to it, is that we are going to have to look at broadening the base, increasing the overall tax take. So first you need to set your target, and then set out how you're going to get there, and whether it's through reform, base broadening. But at the end of the day, all of us are going to have to contribute more. Every sector is going to have to contribute more. But I mean, all of us are then net beneficiaries of the services and infrastructure that this additional revenue would require. And sorry, I misspoke. Our overall, what we would say that the tax target should be is equivalent to 15,000 euros, per capita in 2017 terms, and should increase each year in line with GNI star growth. So thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Gerard, you may have a different list, and a very, very different list potentially. But I suppose, first of all, in your view, do you think that the revenue base needs to increase on a per capita basis, or indeed some other basis? Are there taxes that you would cut? But if you do agree with the notion that revenue needs to increase, what would your focus be on?
So yeah, I think probably there's a couple of areas. One is that I think no matter what, the tax base is going to have to increase the amount of revenue the state collects, and for a number of reasons. One, because of population aging. I think Michael talked in his piece about the gap between Ireland and other European countries. Part of that is down to defence spending, and part of it, a big enough chunk, is down to spending on pensions and aging. And of course, there is the other side where we spend more on young people versus other European countries. But as the population ages, and we're 10 years younger than the rest of Europe, there's going to be a need to raise revenue to offset some of that. And that's probably going to happen over time. And I liked Michael's homeopathic phrase. I think I might rob that myself. That it's about how you do some of those increases. The other thing that has been agreed by almost everyone, both ourselves, trade union movement, and anyone with fairly good sense in this area, is on pensions and auto enrollment, that we are going to see increases in both employer and employee contributions to ensure sustainable pensions for the 50% or so of workers that don't either pay into a pension themselves or don't have an employer contribution into a pension on their behalf. That's going to have to change. Because in the long run, I think if you look at it from even a business point of view, you don't have a sustainable consumer economy if you have a lot of people with very inadequate pensions in the long run. The other areas, I think I was writing down a list while we went through them. One is on PRSI, which has been mentioned. I think PRSI rates inevitably are going to go up both for employer and employees if we're intent and I think there's a debate about what we want to do. I think PRSI is very different than tax in that you're funding something very specific in the social insurance fund. It's in work and out of work benefits through the social welfare system. I think we'd be better off starting about what kind of system, social insurance system, we want first. Whether we want a wage linked system like most European countries, whether we want something that has a kind of a short-term work model that's more developed, like the Kurzarbeit in Germany. And I think a lot of employers have seen the benefit of that in the EWSS, which won't happen again without some kind of contribution in the interim, in future recessions. If you want a model that expands working age benefits, and I think the Taoiseach made a speech at our annual conference, our annual dinner very recently, where he outlined a lot of working age benefits he'd like to increase, and the other side of that is PRSI will have to increase. So PRSI will go up. I think we'll end up having a debate about how much and for what, but I think it will go up. And then the other side, if you look at the Irish tax system, there's probably three areas. One is on wealth in general. We probably undertax immovable capital relative to transaction taxes. So things like local property tax are probably lower here than they are in other countries, and we probably still rely too much on stamp duty and other taxes like that. Inheritance tax in the same vein. Carbon taxes are going to go up, but will disappear over time. And excise taxes that we collect on fuel are going to disappear. €5 billion worth of VAT and excise duty is going to disappear that we collect now, and we're going to have to find a way to collect money to replace that. There's no permanent tax cut there. And then on top of that, things like site value tax we've always supported. And then there's a question around base broadening. So if you have a more developed social insurance model, do you need to have as narrow a tax and income tax base as we have, which is really unusual in a European context. And that's going to be part of that Commission on Tax debate. So there are lots of areas where I think the state is going to look bigger. I don't know if everyone here will agree with me on how much bigger. I think we'll probably disagree on that, but it definitely will look bigger over time. And then on Michael's point, in the department, I suppose, make their projections every budget on a no policy change basis. They assume that nothing changes, so it looks like nothing changes, I guess. But I think policy will change, and I think this Commission on Tax and Social Welfare will be the first part of that. And as you say, probably budget 2024, where we'll see the outworkings of the start of that. And then going back to Michael's point around that homeopathic model of doing it, whatever you do, you don't do it in one sharp shot. You try and take account of everything at once, because I think the big challenge is that we start doing things one by one and you don't have an overall vision for where you want the model to be. So I take a different approach than I suppose what Michelle has outlined in saying, here's how much tax we should raise and then decide how to spend it. I'd say we need to decide what model we want on the other end first, what we want to fund, what social insurance model we want, what we want to do with childcare and other areas. And then we need to decide how to collect the money for that. And I think we're going to get into that space pretty quickly in the next couple of years. And we could end up with a very different looking state because of it. On the tax cut side, there's lots of small areas where I'd change tax, but I think in net terms, there's almost no space for tax cuts over and above maybe indexation or partial indexation in the next decade or so. Purely because we have so much other things going on in terms of public investment, low carbon, and lots of other areas, population aging and all the rest.
Thanks for that, Gerard. A lot to chew on again. Michael, what about you? Case for cutting taxes, or are you on the other side of the house?
No, there's very whatever about as Gerard said, whatever about indexing credits or rate bands or whatever. There's no room for overall tax because we will have to raise our revenue base. If we benchmark Europe, there's two areas that just shout out. Now, I'm not saying we slavishly, because European systems have different systems. But if you just look at the average and just kind of move towards that, there's two areas where we are substantially undertaxed or under contributions. One is the employer social insurance area. Now, again, we don't have to have as high level of social insurance at this stage because of the lower pensioner numbers relative to other countries. But nonetheless, we would still have to substantially increase employer social insurance. I'm not so sure about increasing employees' social insurance because when you combine income tax and social insurance under the rubric of personal taxation, Irish PAY workers, PAY employees, are average by EU standards. So you could shift from income tax. You could shift from income tax over to social insurance among employees, but in one sense, that's just a shift on paper. It doesn't get you any more revenue. Where we actually need the extra revenues from employer social insurance. And secondly, capital taxation. I mean, it is far better to tax capital assets, wealth, than it is income. And I think, we're going to have to look at the way we tax assets, whether that's a site value tax, whether it's an increase in property tax. We also have to ask a question. Is there any argument in equity or economic efficiency for taxing income from capital at a much lower rate than income from labor? There's always the caveat, of course, that one shouldn't do anything that undermines economic efficiency or undermines social equity. But those are caveats that you apply to everything. So what is the argument in equity or efficiency for giving capital income such a pass in terms of taxation? And for instance, the SRI looked at some of those options, and interestingly, they found one kind of relief, the entrepreneurial tax relief. This is a tax relief provided to people who sell off assets in their business. I've never known why someone would give a tax relief when you're selling off. I thought, if anything, you'd want to give a tax relief when they're starting up. But what they found was that the cash benefit of the tax relief that went to these people, 40% went to for people to pay down their debts, and 30% to put in their pension fund. Now, I don't begrudge any household, paying down their debts or increasing their pension contributions, but why should people have to subsidize that? In other words, we have a lot of tax reliefs and a lot of things, even in spending, which really require a forensic analysis to see what is either the distributional or the economic benefit or impact that comes from it, and act accordingly. But those two areas, employer social insurance and intake taxes on capital assets and wealth, those are the two key areas that we should be looking at over the long term if we want to move our taxation system to something like a European norm.
Okay, so generally from the tree view, as a sense, I'm getting tax expenditures, PRSI, and again, depending on the type of model that we want to have, and at the very least, the immovable component of wealth, and then maybe a little bit of disagreement on some other areas, but that perhaps forming a kind of a basis, and indeed environmental taxes as well. I just have one question here from Joe Larragee. He asks, does the state have much control in relation to risks of inflation and heightened cyclicality? Gerard, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I think we're a small, very, very open economy. If you look at the increment of the budget each year, we spent whatever 90 billion odd as a state last year, and you have a 1.5 billion budget on top of that. Any given year, the budget is pretty small. So that the room for fiscal policy to greatly impact on inflation in Ireland is probably much less than in other countries. And you can see the examples of it now, where we have really high European gas prices that feed through about half of the inflation rate we're seeing right now, or our energy prices driven by European gas prices, and we have almost no control over what we pay there. The same with inflation in terms of other areas. I think the one area where we have some control of inflation is in the labour market, how you manage changes in the labour market, how you, I guess, mediate in terms of wages. We still have some control there, and the direction of fiscal policy in terms of its ability to give you one example, actually, in terms of labour and inflation and how that passes through. We probably have excess demand already because of the housing crisis in the construction sector for workers. If we have the capacity to fix that crisis, I don't know if you can do it at the same time as you're fixing other problems, particularly in retrofitting. There's going to be a big challenge there. Whether you have capacity, and I think the one thing the government can do is try and build capacity through fiscal policy, and that's a massive focus for us, both in the education sector and innovation in other areas, that you can try and improve productivity, you can try and improve capacity in training and skills. But in terms of trying to control prices at a macroeconomic level, I think it's really difficult in a small open economy like ours, just because we are basically a region within Europe in economic terms.
Michelle, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sorry, unmuting myself. Yeah, I mean, we are challenged in terms of controlling for some of those aspects in terms of inflation and heightened cyclicality, as Gerard mentioned. I mean, also we're subject to the fiscal rules. You know, energy prices are contributing at the moment, but I think, and Gerard pointed out, one of the key challenges, and you know, if we meet, depending on what you pick from the National Development Plan, is how are you going to deliver the targets in housing for all? How are you going to retrofit all those houses? You know, who's your pool? Where is the pool? Who are you going to upskill? And then where are you going to get the additional labor so that they're not working at odds with each other? And you know, that's going to be a challenge, and something that was referenced earlier. And I think it's important that I suppose we should be working towards this at a European level. You know, there's talk of getting back to the, you know, releasing the brake, getting back to where the fiscal rules should be. But given what's in the Green Deal for Europe, what's coming out in the Climate Action Plan, we should certainly be pushing for that a green investment, you know, is not subject to the stringent fiscal rules at a European level. Because if we don't, and we don't achieve that, then we're in a very, very challenging situation, given how far we have to go along the road of meeting our own targets.
Yeah, and Michael, I know the EU Economic Governance Review is just beginning, and that's the process which will ultimately determine what the new fiscal rules are, what they might be. I mean, what do you think the direction of travel on that should be?
Well, I think there's two directions. One is a minimal road, whereby certain types of green investment would be excluded from the deficit calculations and the debt calculations. That would facilitate green investment. I mean, again, the IMF has looked at Ireland and other countries, and there's going to have to be a substantial increase in investment in green technologies, retrofitting, mitigation measures. If we're going to stand any chance of meeting our targets, never mind overcoming climate chaos. So the minimum would be to exempt certain green items from the deficit procedure. The best one would be to go back to the golden rule, and that is you balance or even run a slight surplus on your current account, and you borrow for investment. And the fiscal rules should allow for investment to be borrowed. Now, obviously, they would want to come in. They'd want to make sure that people are not trying to game the system, that the investment is a qualitative investment. You can actually do that on net investments after depreciation, whatever the formula would be. But in other words, you go back to the golden rule, and this would help drive investment. Certainly, it would help drive investment in the Eurozone, which was particularly hammered after the recession and the period the periods of austerity. So those would be two key areas. Apart from the larger questions of debt burden sharing, if you will, measures to reduce the debts off states' books, because the amount of resources that we're going to need to meet challenges, not only like climate change, but that would be big enough as it is. You've got the challenge of automation and the digitalization of the economy, which will require substantial just transition measures. In Ireland, we still have infrastructural deficit dating before the pandemic. Never mind the pandemic social repair. Never mind Brexit will still continue to have a depressing effect on economic activity. And of course, the one thing that no one wants to talk about or is interested in talking about, and that is that almost all forecasters predict that by the end of this decade, we will be entering into a 20-year economic drought of low interest rates, low employment growth, and all the consequences that would have on budgets, not only for Ireland, but throughout Europe. So it's a huge challenge, not only just how to calculate deficits and budgets and stuff like that, but to provide the resources at national and European level to help countries and peoples to overcome these challenges.
Yeah, if we do indeed enter a long period of secular stagnation, Gerard, I wonder, what do you think the implications of that are for fiscal policy and interest rates and the ability to run higher than the normal deficits? And just to follow on somewhat from Michael's point, he suggests a golden rule for capital, and you've often made the point that public R&D spending, for example, is very, very low in Ireland, as it is in the UK and a lot of the Anglo countries, in fact. But do you think R&D should also be included as part within the package of broader investment, if there were to be some kind of rule?
I think we're in a space where I think most people are actually broadly in agreement on what needs to be done, apart from the European Commission and some European politicians on the fiscal rules. There's probably three areas for us. One is the 60% debt target in the current environment. And in any environment, it's wrong. In the current environment, it's insane. In that you will end up with surpluses needed by some countries, particularly Italy and Greece, which are impossible politically to deliver. So you're asking people to do things which they can't, in effect. If you keep that 60% target, it should probably be closer to 80 or 90% if they do keep it. The green investment and other investment, including, I think, public R&D, I agree with. In the first instance, like the Fit for 55 plan from the Commission talks about climate change as existential. It would say something very detrimental about how existential we think that is, if in the first instance we keep climate and climate-related investments within the same fiscal framework as all other all of other spending, including current spending, capital spending, tax cuts, and all the rest. So in the first instance, that is, as Michael said, probably the least you could expect is that they reflect the green investment agenda. There's probably a broader one. We've said in the past that there should be a public investment target written into the fiscal rules. If you look across Europe, public investment and public capital stock, if you take away the depreciation of the stock, public capital stock in Europe has been falling for 2 decades.
Yeah.
And it's a major challenge across not just Ireland, but lots of other countries. We've had it for cyclical reasons. Other countries have had it for political reasons, in effect, and you need to have some kind of anchor against the fact that politicians are incentivized to engage in tax cuts or current spending ahead of capital at any point in the cycle. There's always a weight in that direction politically. You probably need a counterweight in fiscal rules to incentivize productive spending. I think the challenge is, and look, there's more that can be said about output gaps, how they measure them, and the pro-cyclicality and the insane measures that they use, right? So that's probably getting too technical, right? But the biggest challenge when it comes to investment, and we made this point before at a European level, is that you then get into a row about what's productive investment and what's non-productive investment. Do you count childcare? Do you count education? And you get into different areas. And that argument, although it's well-meaning in many cases, actually makes it more difficult to sell at a European level, because other people who don't want any investment, given preferential treatment in the fiscal rules, point to it and say, well, they're just going to have everything as preferential. So, how can why do we have any rules at all? So I think you have to be limited. I think public investment, green investment in particular, and public R&D spending are probably the 3 areas that I think you need to contain in there. And we have definitions, very clear definitions of what they are already from Eurostat, from the Commission and other areas, which helps.
I suppose slightly changing the subject, but obviously we can focus on productivity and education, infrastructure, R&D and all of that, but obviously there needs to be a focus on employment as well. And obviously one of the big barriers to employment for certain groups in Ireland is the cost of childcare. And I wonder, and Michelle, I might go to you first. I mean, where do we need to go over the medium term to solve this issue? Because clearly we have been failing so far. Is it simply an issue of lack of investment? I mean, the model doesn't seem to be working for businesses, it doesn't seem to be working for the workers, and it doesn't seem to be working for parents. So if it's not working for anybody, do we need to look at a fundamental relook at how we deal with childcare?
I think we do. I mean, it's not working for anyone. I suppose we're at the top of the table, in not in a good way, because most our childcare is primarily provided to the private providers. We don't have a state system of providing childcare. And I think what the announcement in the budget, it doesn't do a number of things. It doesn't provide for more places. It doesn't give the non-contact time that providers need and managers need, just to manage their centres. It doesn't deal with the high staff turnover. It doesn't deal with the wages issue. It doesn't deal with, can you find a place depending on where you live? For example, in Dublin, it's very challenging. Or if you're in a rural area, how far away is it? I think on that road, and I think, if you look at the country reports and the country-specific recommendations from the Commission over the past at least 5 years, childcare and access to childcare comes up repeatedly. And I certainly think that's one of the areas that in terms of investment, we should be looking at. But as a start, if you want to change the model fundamentally, but you have to look at how you're going to get there. One of the more practical things that can be done in the meantime, if you really want to bring down costs for families, is you need to separate out the wage budget from delivering the service in the first place. So if the state took on the wage budget for a start and committed to a living wage for those workers, then the providers would be able to pass on, they would have lower costs, and they should be able to pass these on to families. But the situation that we have now, I mean, as a result of the pandemic, some centres are on reduced hours, but parents aren't on reduced working hours. you know, so how do you square that circle? In terms of school now, in terms of public health advice and testing and symptoms, you know, there's a challenge on parents again then if a child has to be kept out of school for a number of days or out of a childcare setting, you know, who does that fall on? Primarily it falls on women. And you know, I suppose 19 months ago, there was a talk about how we needed to rethink everything, and we were all reevaluating about, you know, how we did things with the initial lockdown. That, and you know, spending more time with your family, having more family-friendly work practices, and how we delivered childcare was part of that. Yet that discussion seems to have just been pushed to one side in this move back to a new normal, and that misses the point, because, you know, it's that and housing are two of the fundamental things that impact both on, you know, employers, employees, and on family life. And yet we don't have either a strategy or a vision of how we're really going to improve this for families. So I think at a very, 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 you know, immediate starting point, you need to take the wage cost away from the providers so that they can deliver reduced costs to parents, and the state takes on that and looks at the issues around staff turnover and a living wage. But ultimately we need to move towards a publicly funded model that you have across the rest of the European Union.
Gerard?
Yeah, I suppose childcare is something we have a new childcare sector in IBEC in the last 18 months or so, and at both a personal level and at a workplace level, I'm realizing how much of a nightmare that whole system is. Look, there's probably two things. One, we have a first five strategy that exists, but it's out to 2028 and effectively, given where inflation is going to go, more than likely, particularly in the labour market, in real terms, it's not a huge increase out to 2028. That it's a strategy that's very incremental. I think if there's one area we were talking earlier about, where would you see scope for increasing taxes to pay for something from an employer point of view, childcare is the area that we get, along with housing, probably the most from employers in terms of trying to keep people in the labour force. So we have to accelerate that strategy in terms of funding. The model in the long term, I think, is a difficult one, because you have this kind of mixed model where we're almost slowly nationalising parts of the industry in subsidy format. The industry itself is making very little money in kind of margin. The workers aren't making great wages, and staff turnover as a result is high. There's challenges throughout it. And then you have other things like insurance costs, rental costs, and all the rest. So it is a really messy industry, and probably will need a lot more state intervention. How far that goes, it's hard to tell, but it's definitely higher than it is now. And then probably there's a broader issue in that childcare, while it's the most difficult part of caring now, I think in elder care as well, we're going to have a growing problem in the next decade, that will also need support. So you actually have a growing problem that I think it hasn't really emerged in Ireland in the way it has in other countries, and is going to be a massive issue where we sit around tables at the OECD or Business Europe. We listen to other countries and they talk about elder care the way we talk about childcare, and they talk about childcare the way we talk about childcare in some instances. So to find a model of caring that works from a labour market point of view is enormous. And we go back to that capacity challenge. If you can't get almost half the workforce into the workforce for key years of their careers because they're the cost of childcare, and for many people it doesn't make sense, then it's a major workplace challenge, both from an employer and an employee point of view. So it's an area that is going to require a lot of focus, and I have no doubt is probably going to be one of the areas that will come back to in future budgets again and again in the next decade.
I think that's certain. Michael, we only have 1 minute left.
Okay, I'll be very quick, because the solution is quite simple and it's right in front of us. SIPTU, through its Big Start campaign, which is made up of members, childcare workers who are members of SIPTU. It's very clear. First off, the government assumes the payment of wages. They're the only body that can ensure not only a decent wage, but wages that reflect the growing professionalization of that. The government assumes the wages. Wages make up 70% of the inputs into providing childcare service. If the government takes that over, costs fall by 2/3. You then bring in fees regulation and bring down fees. You cap it at something like 60, 65 euros a week. So you bring it, you assume the wages, you increase the wages to reflect professionalization, and you cap the fees at 60 to 65. We've even costed this. It would cost 500 million euros. 500 million. Now you couldn't do it in 1 year. There's a lot of rationalization in the sector that has to happen because there's 4,500 providers of early year services. But 500 million is what it would cost. If you consider that the fiscal rules would have allowed us nearly 2 billion euros more expenditure next year, you could see what you could have for 500 million, even if you had to phase that over 3 years. Actually, the government gets it because they have a similar thing whereby providers can avail of this fund, which will go to bring everybody up to a living wage, and they'll have to freeze the wages. So they kind of get the principle. They have to go a lot further, and they certainly, like Gerard said, you don't wait till 2028. But that's it, 500 million, you have professional wages, you have affordable childcare fees. What is the issue?
Well, the issue now is that we are out of time. I'd like to thank all three of you for excellent presentations and for contributions to the question and answer session. We'll circulate the video and put it up on the website as well, as per usual. And I'd like to thank you all very, very much for taking time to enlighten us with your views on Budget 2022. And maybe I will see all three of you again next year for what will hopefully be a more radical and transformative budget. Thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.